So freed slaves started to gain more rights in the South, and juries became integrated. This was at the assistance of federal troops. But what some states did in order to reduce the impact of having integrated juries is having what's called a split jury rule, meaning that you could have a vote of 10 to 2 for conviction, and a person could be convicted actually and sentenced to death. And the idea behind this is so that if you had 2 black people on the jury, it would eliminate their influence. And to this day, 1 or 2 states actually still has a split jury rule. Democratic primaries were private clubs. Basically, they had a white primary. The people in the Democratic Party were not interested in what black people would have to say. And that was declared unconstitutional, but not until 1933. So Negroes can vote in Texas primary. And this was a very important decision with regard to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That act required the pre-approval or pre-clearance of any changes in voting in certain states that had a history of voter suppression. And those changes might include closing a polling station, changing the hours, changing the requirements of what documentation it took in order to vote. And you might want to stop this video and hear about the Shelby County case, which is in your modules, and we'll get right back. Okay, so the Justice Department pre-clearance no longer permitted in these 9 states, and the High Court guts the Voting Rights Act. I'm sorry, this is the one I actually wanted you to watch, so hopefully that's the one you did see. So the voting restrictions covered what were slave states, and it no longer covers them. And as you know, voter ID and all these allegations of voter fraud don't stand up to any type of scrutiny. I believe these are merely ways of suppressing the minority vote. Okay, so officially the end of Reconstruction was 1877, and the so-called Redeemers of the South came back into office. All the former leaders who were barred from running their states were able to come back and do business as usual. And this was the beginning of the Jim Crow era, the idea that you could segregate the races. Now remember, after the 14th Amendment, you could no longer have a black code, meaning you can't actually say Negroes are not allowed to own guns or anything like that, but you could segregate the races, and that is what's called the Jim Crow laws. So that would have been from 1877 all the way until the 1960s. So it required racial segregation between this 1877 and the Civil Rights Movement. So this might be a sign that you saw. So public facilities were segregated. You would have different drinking fountains, one for whites, one for colored. And even on private property, they'd have segregated theaters. So you go to a white theater or a black theater. Separate dining rooms. That is the colored dining room. I suspect the white dining room might be a little nicer. This looks like a little more than an outhouse. And separate entrances, the white entrance and the colored entrance. Most hotels that catered to white people would not allow black people, so you had an entire industry catering to black travelers. Waiting rooms at public train and bus stations were also segregated. And even burial grounds, I find this pretty amazing, that the dead had to be segregated as well. And certain businesses, even if not required by law, decided that they're going to cater to one race only. Here it says, we wash for white people only. It's a laundry. Perhaps the most egregious offense against the free slaves was public education, or lack of public education. And that was promoted through segregated schools. This is a black schoolhouse. And that brings us to the case of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, a landmark Supreme Court case. This established the doctrine of separate but equal. This is the dissenting opinion, and I think it's fantastic. I'd like to read it to you. But in view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. So the question is separate ever really equal? I suspect not. And if you look at the white waiting room and the black waiting room, the white dining room and the black dining room, it occurs to many people that separate is never going to be equal. And there was a lot of racial tension in this country, the early part of the 20th century. Here's one, a race riot in Springfield that took a number of lives. During this period, there was a lot of racist hatred and construction of the Confederate monuments, which were not constructed, by the way, anywhere near the time of the Civil War. They were constructed way after, as you can see from this chart. And you might have heard about this, the Tulsa race riots in 1921. And this is a song by Nina Simone, Strange Fruit. If you're interested, just open up that PowerPoint and you can click on it. So around the time of these race riots was the founding of the NAACP, National Association for Advancement of Colored Persons. And this is one of the main founders, W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's one of the organizations that I support. I'm a life member. One of the reasons that Black family net worth assets is very small compared to white, and the disparity is much greater in terms of wealth and income, although there's a big disparity in income as well. It was mortgage redlining. A lot of banks, and in fact even the government, decided that vast areas of cities, they would not lend any money. And these were typically the Black areas. And how about VA mortgages for these returning WW2 heroes? Answer, no. They were redlined and discriminated against. And if you think about a family's net worth, intergenerational, starting in the 1940s, a lot of their worth is based on real estate. The family home is almost always the largest asset for most families, and if you can't get your foot on a rung on this ladder, the property ladder, if you want to call it that, you're never going to amass any wealth. And this is one of the reasons for the disparity in wealth between black and white. So 2 generations later, the effects are still felt. Home ownership rates are a little more than half for black Americans compared to white. Another reason why black people couldn't own real estate are these secret covenants. There'd be real estate developments, and right in the deed, it would restrict the sale of property to somebody who was not white. These are no longer enforceable. Finally, the Supreme Court in 1954, and this is a case you need to know, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. And the Supreme Court held that separate is inherently unequal. This case overruled Plessy versus Ferguson. The court ordered integration of the segregated schools with all deliberate speed. And the Arkansas National Guard was called out by the Arkansas governor to use force if necessary to stop these high school students from attending Central High School in Little Rock. They actually blocked the entrance. This was in direct violation of federal court order. So President Eisenhower federalized the State National Guard, which any president is allowed to do. And then the president and the United States military takes charge of the State National Guard. So he federalized the National Guard and enforced the court orders. He also sent in the 101st Airborne to make sure that there wouldn't be any violence against those guardsmen. And this was the Governor Faubus, who was outraged. And he was complaining that guns forced integration. Well, he should realize that it's guns that end slavery as well. Now, Brown versus Board of Education applied only to public education. So after 1954, there was still plenty of segregation, but it was only barred in schools. And that took the civil rights movement to change that. Here's one of the Freedom Riders. You're probably familiar with her. Montgomery bus boycott, 1956. And that, of course, was Rosa Parks. As Martin Luther King said, freedom is never voluntarily given up by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Martin Luther King quoted John 8:32, "Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And I'm going to read this to you because I think it's important in today's environment. I want to discuss the race problem tonight, and I want to discuss it very honestly. I still believe that freedom is the bonus you receive for telling the truth. Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And I don't see how we will ever solve the turbulent problem of race confronting our nation until there is an honest confrontation with it and a willing search for the truth and a willingness to admit the truth when we discover it. That was back in 1967, and as you can see, even today, people really are trying to avoid discussing this and getting it out in the open. I think this video is worth seeing. You might want to stop the one you're listening to now and go to modules and click on it. This is Trevor Noah's take on when is the right time to protest. And I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, there's two types of segregation. You need to know this. One is de jure, meaning by law in Latin. Laws that create segregation, and these were common in the South. And then de facto segregation. No law requiring that just different neighborhoods develop different areas and people self-segregate. Okay, so let's look at de jure, discrimination arising or supported by law, like segregated restrooms. It's pretty easy to combat, and we pretty much do not have any more de jure discrimination today. There are no laws barring people because of race from restrooms or schools or anything like that. The other one is de facto discrimination, and we have plenty of that. Discrimination that is the result of tradition or habit. For instance, neighborhoods in northern cities are segregated not by law, but by individual choice. Of course, this would be harder to combat. And it's overcome with substantive policies like affirmative action. So as I was saying, de jure desegregation has been eliminated in this country by the end of the 1960s. However, de facto segregation still existed, and business owners might decide to segregate their lunch counter, not because the law required it, but just because they chose to do that. So in response to the de facto segregation in the South, the segregated lunch counters, that type of thing, there was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. So these were the key civil rights federal pieces of federal regulation. And some cities, very progressive cities, I lived in a place called Teaneck, New Jersey. So this was voluntary busing to integrate the school. They basically created a central 6th grade school in a black neighborhood. And so all the white kids had to be bused into the black neighborhood. It looks very nice today, but this was kind of rough way back when. That was the central 6th grade school. It no longer is. So this was sort of a scary time for me because, you know, fear. So I got my black leather jacket. That's me in 1965. Looking tough, right? Okay. So the federal government, through the courts, forced busing. This was very unpopular in a lot of different places. In Southie, which is an area of Boston dominated by Irish Americans, they were horrified by the idea of busing their kids or integrating their schools. And this is called reactionary populism. And you might want to look at that on the PowerPoint. So Judge Garrity was the federal district court judge that ordered the integration. And this is Boston speak for getting go get lost, take it Dudley. And this is one of the most disturbing photographs in memory, at least for me. There's a white man using an American flag standard to attack a black man who's wearing a suit. This was during the forced busing. And a lot of white people were totally bent out of shape. Okay, and here's another fun video. Feel free to watch it if you'd like. It's on the PowerPoint. Let's take a look at affirmative action. We had talked about equality or equity. Equality is treating both races exactly the same, but that does not take into account white affirmative action, like legacy admissions at Ivy League schools and privileged private schools and that type of thing. So fairness would suggest, or equity would suggest, that there'd be some affirmative action. Equality would suggest that everybody be treated the same. Is white privilege real? Now, most white people think whatever they have, they earned, and a lot of them did work hard, so that's understandable. And they kind of refuse to admit that they started off in an unlevel playing field. Here's affirmative action for white folks. These are legacy admissions. If your father, grandfather went to Harvard, say, you have a much, much better chance of getting in. If you're black, it's probably a pretty good bet your grandfather did not go to Harvard. Here's your typical white person who thinks that they had no advantage at all. My dad gave me a small loan of $1 million. Now, this was back in the early 70s in New York City real estate. If you invested that $1 million in New York City real estate in 1971, that would probably be worth $50 million today. That's how much real estate appreciated. And $1 million back in 1971 was probably the equivalent of about $5 or $6 million today. I wish my father gave me a small loan of $1 million back then. Some people are born on third base and go through life thinking they hit a triple. Okay, so our current Supreme Court, you can call it ideologically conservative. Diversity is no excuse for racism. So it's interesting now, conservative white people are banging the drum of racial equality, and the races should be treated the same now that they have such a great advantage. I think this cartoon sums it up. Okay, so affirmative action are policies that take gender, race, or ethnicity into account in an attempt to promote equal opportunity. Is affirmative action constitutional? Sometimes. If it's established there's been past discrimination, and as long as there are no use of quotas or preferences. So you can't say 22% of the entering class has to be a certain race. However, here in California, there was a ballot amendment a number of years ago that bars our state universities from using racial preferences or quotas to remedy past discrimination. So there is some justification for affirmative action. Obviously, remedy social discrimination, promoting diversity, correcting deficit of disfavored minorities. Okay, and here's the Fisher case. This is the one that held the quota system to be unconstitutional. So argument, the Constitution is colorblind. Racial considerations of any kind are prohibited by the 14th Amendment. And so conservatives will say that now there are white victims of racial discrimination. Of course, the whole purpose of the 14th Amendment was to elevate black people. This is the Dahl test. If any of you are majoring in psychology or sociology, you may have seen this, but this would be a good time to stop this video, go to modules and watch the Dahl test. And we'll see if the colorblind approach ignores important social realities. And I'll be right back with you. Okay, so what's going on here? We all have our racial biases. Is this a white police officer chasing a black suspect? Or is the black man a police officer leading a white officer to an incident? Um, it's the second one that's true, that black gentleman is a police officer. So if you look at the original purpose of the 14th Amendment, one could make a good constitutional argument saying that it's okay to discriminate against white people if it brings up the black people in order to level the playing field. One very effective tool is nonviolent civil disobedience, and this was used by Mahatma Gandhi in the liberation of India from the English in the late 1940s. Okay, there's also discrimination based on ethnicity. And like with race, the court will apply a strict scrutiny test. There better be a compelling state reason to do it. And as we mentioned before, discrimination based on gender is an intermediate level of scrutiny. The state needs a very good, not compelling, but a very good reason to treat the genders differently. So here we have gender. This is the intermediate scrutiny, or a quasi-suspect classification. So early 19th century women, not allowed to vote. They had the status of a minor. They couldn't own property in their own name if they were married. They basically had the same rights as a child. And of course, the idea was to keep them barefoot and pregnant. And you may have heard this rule of thumb. If you know that expression, you might know that a man couldn't beat his wife with a stick that was wider than his thumb. The women's rights movement really began in 1848 in Seneca Falls, which is in upstate New York, and this convention. And this is one of the founders, along with Susan B. Anthony, of the women's rights movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And the woman actually ran for president in 1872. Here's one of my favorite quotes from Susan B. Anthony: "No man is good enough to govern any woman without her consent." And Congress rejected the Voting Rights Amendment for women. Interestingly enough, a number of state legislatures allowed women to vote. Some of the western states, I suspect because women did what was traditionally men's roles out west in terms of cattle, farming, shooting guns, that type of thing. Here's a timeline of women's rights in the United States. These women were upset that the 15th Amendment, which allowed black men to vote, did not include women. And of course, a lot of guys were freaked out at this idea that women could vote. And this is kind of an amusing video. It's optional on your part if you want to watch it, but this is some preacher explaining why God wants women to stay home and make babies and not really do anything outside of the house. Women should be quiet, keepers at home, silent in church, submissive to husbands. How convenient. And President Wilson was against women's suffrage and actually had some of these suffragettes beaten in front of the White House. And then finally, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, the 19th Amendment in 1920, citizens of the United States right to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. Okay, and here's sort of a timeline of women's rights. And there used to be these commercials. They used to advertise cigarettes on television. And I remember how women now have the right to smoke in public if they want to. They weren't allowed back in the day. So they've come a long, long way. And now women have equal rights to die of lung cancer just like men. Okay, let's look at gender discrimination. There's something called the Equal Rights Amendment. Equal rights, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. And that was the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. It was never ratified. There was a big backlash against this by conservative women who had this group called, I forgot their name, but it was basically to stop the ERA. And they were concerned about this. They thought their daughters would be drafted into combat roles. So most of the states voted to ratify it, but it was 1 or 2 states short. And time has run out anyway because Congress gave the states 10 years to ratify and the states didn't. If they took a vote today, it would be ratified, but they can't take a vote today because you'd have to start the process all over again. At this point, would it really matter if the ERA passed? Probably no, because women do have equal rights in almost all areas. There might be certain things in the military that they're barred from, but as I understand it, there are fighter pilots and combatants that are women. So I don't know that women are discriminated against legally at all today. Certainly in the workplace and that type of thing, there's still discrimination going on. But I'm not sure the ERA would change that. What did change some things was the Equal Pay Act of 1963. This was under the Kennedy administration. Equal pay for equal work. But of course, in the workforce, women, just like men, but cheaper. So a lot of women earn about 77 cents on the dollar compared to what men make. Sometimes, if you follow the Grand Slam events, the men play the best of 5 sets, the women play the best of 3 sets, they get paid the same. So sometimes women get the same pay for less work, but this is the exception, not the rule. And of course, in the adult film industry, women make a multiple of what men make. Okay, so let's continue here. We're going to take a brief break and then continue on with the third video.